Hello everyone, and thank you for watching our video. Today we are going to present you an horizontal approach to communication for human-robot joint action toward situated and sustainable robotics. This paper is part of a project funded by the French Agency of Research, which is called Joint Action for Human-Robot Interaction. And this project aims to improve joint action between human and robots, taking insights from philosophy, psychology, and robotics. We are now going to introduce you the context around the paper and how we got the idea and the associated literature. There are many definitions of joint action, and these definitions diverge according to scientific communities or even inside of the same community. So we choose to base our work on the definition proposed by Sevens and collaborator, which is that any form of social interaction whereby two or more individuals coordinate their action in space and time to bring about a change in the environment. In the context of our projects, we aim to improve joint action in human and robot interaction. So we figured out that communication is the real challenge when we speak about interaction between humans and robots. Here we talk about communication, but in a way that facilitates this joint action and cooperation. After a while, we realized that to have working interaction in the wild, the current approach to communication in social robotics needs to be complemented. We also realized that our general intuition was shared by other scholars, thinking that we need a more general approach to social robotics, like Young and colleagues. Our aim is to propose a first sketch of a model that we call the horizontal model. We think it complements the current state of the art approach, which we have called the building block model. Before introducing our views on the two models, we choose to show you a few examples of communicative mechanisms currently existing in the literature for interacting with humans. For interacting with humans, robot needs to be enabled with mechanisms producing and understanding communicative signals. Some examples of these mechanisms are gaze cues to signal the object of interest, or head position and light indicators to communicate navigational intentions.
Now, we are going to introduce you what we call the building block model. It is not an exhaustive representation of the current state of the art in social robotics, but more a list of characteristics that we have consistently found in the literature. We think it gives us a general idea of the actual design process of communicative mechanisms in social robotics. The name building block model aims at illustrating the idea that when a communicative feature is currently developed for a robot, it is put as independent from other communicative features, so as a unique block. Then, each block is assembled in the robot, but without taking into account their influence and interaction on other blocks. Before we pass to present the two models, we also want to make clear that we are not confronting two competing views. In fact, we consider that the building block model reflects a necessary step in the design process. But we would like to motivate the idea that the model needs to be complemented and provide some illustration of why and in which sense this complementation is necessary. The first characteristic of the building block model we defined is the contextual isolation of the investigated mechanism from the collaborative activity itself. For instance, as Cavallo and colleagues have emphasized, studies on emotion modeling and recognition do not consider the final application of the model and mechanisms which, when applied to real situations, can provoke misunderstanding or confusion. This can be the case with smiles, because the facial configuration of the smile can be interpreted as happiness or embarrassment, depending on the relevant context. The second characteristic of the model we introduce you is the impersonal approach to communicative strategies. Several mechanisms produce pro-social and motivational expressions, maintaining the human partner engaged into the collaborative task. But they do not take into account that certain motivational expressions can be inappropriate depending on the actual preference of the human, or that the human may create an emotional dependence with the robot. For instance, Gordon and colleagues have developed a quasi-motivational mechanism modulating the robot's tendency to interact and producing more or less social actions depending on a given threshold. But the mechanism never takes into consideration the current state of the human or her preference or desire to interact. The background isolation is the third characteristic of the building block model. This makes reference to the fact that developments in social robotics usually dissociates the communicative mechanisms from the background information that could be relevant for the joint action, including social norms, previous interactions with the partner, or cultural variability. Not taking into account such information may produce misunderstanding. For instance, to scrunch the nose in a particular direction is understood as an expression of disgust in Western cultures, while it is understood as a pointing gesture in others. Finally, the first characteristic we would like to emphasize is that the building block model often do not consider that joint action is a complex and structured phenomenon with different stages, usually impacting on each other. Not considering how the information generated in one phase may affect others can produce some confusing signals. For instance, to set the roles of the partners during an initial phase of the interaction, like having a hierarchical or egalitarian relation, can influence the meaning of expressions in the following phases, like interpreting an angry face as an accusation or a sign of frustration.
Now we are going to introduce you what we call the horizontal model. We choose this name as this model aims to have a general approach to design communicative strategies in joint action for HRI. The first characteristic of our horizontal model is contextualism. With this feature, we want to capture the necessity of taking into account how the information provided by the context may affect the developed communicative device, and so it should be captured during its design and tests. For example, a robot guide in a mall in a noisy environment, and so its verbal interactions with humans may be troubled. So it makes sense to design the verbal communication with both dialogue and written text to enable a proper interaction. The second characteristic of the horizontal model is the human-centered approach. It means to put the human preferences, values, and necessities at the center of the design process and test settings. For example, humans can feel uncertain or oddness when perceiving robotic actions, so the design process may consider to make the behavior as transparent as possible in order to avoid it. For example, by simply the robot explaining what it can do and what it cannot do at the beginning of the task to avoid non-coherent expectations. Another example, in the Mayima project, the robot is led to move a few meters to point a shop to customers. However, it doesn't ask customers if they want this, even if they may not feel comfortable about the robot moving. It only warns them. A human-centered way to do it would be for the robot to ask humans if they wanted to move around them or not. The third characteristic of the horizontal model attempts to capture the socially situated nature of communication. Communicative acts are often modulated by social norms, cultural customs, or previous interactions that can modify the meaning of a gesture or even a speech act. Such situatedness could be used to avoid potential problems, for instance, by not using vague expressions or gestures whose meaning could dramatically change depending on the social norm in place. But the impact of social norms and cultural variation can be exploited during the design process, for instance, by enabling robots with different scripts and dialogues depending on the role of the user. An illustration of this point could be a service robot which can select different tone of voice or a vocabulary depending on whether the human is a coworker or a customer. Our last characteristic involves seeing the joint action as a whole, from its initiation to its closure. Indeed, the communication device is often developed according to a particular step of the joint action, but here we miss the opportunity to reuse it for other functions in another step of the joint action. For instance, high signals can be used to communicate robots' commitment to the task, so at the very beginning of the interaction, but also to signal if something goes wrong, so here to maintain the interaction. Finally, it can be a way for the robot to signal the end of its turn.
As we have emphasized about part of our motivation for sketching a complementary approach to the building block model was the necessity of addressing during the design some potential problems that one must face into the wild. However, we also believe that this model can help us to orientate the design of communicative mechanisms toward a more culturally sustainable robotics. The notion of culturally sustained robotics refers to the idea of evaluating and addressing the potential unexpected consequences that social robotics may have in human interaction and culture. For instance, we know that interaction with robots often exploit human psychological mechanisms like empathy or motor contagion, but we don't not know the long-term consequences of this exploitation. And since users cannot choose whether or not to use psychological mechanism of this kind, this can be seen as an affront to the psychological integrity of the human. Another example of why culturally sustained robotics may be necessary is the ethical question of whether or not we are morally entitled to this share of responsibility to take care of elderly people or children on robotic agents. So we believe that a virtue of the horizontal model is precisely to design strategies to address these potential problems. For instance, having a human-centered approach may help to avoid emotional attachment derived from empathy, from empathy as we presented above. For instance, one may design social robots with expressive capacities having the same function as emotion expressions in a given context without triggering attachment from humans, like for instance, giving priority to verbal communication or using more emotionally neutral signals. Another example is how having into account the situation of communication can help us to deal with the potential failures that may turn into moral damages or social violations. So, for instance, enabling robots with the capacity to deal with potential moral or social damage by using the right type of excuse or justification. So finally, if there is a take-home message to this talk, it will be that building blocks and horizontal models are complementary. We don't criticize the building block model as it is a necessary step to design until now human-robot interaction, but we propose a way to go further. For that, we have to integrate the different blocks with each other. We need also to have in mind during the design and test a global view that is the context, the social norms, or the human preference and value. In this way, we can build more efficient and less invasive social robots. Thank you.